Are you a leader who experiences tension in the workplace? Of course you are. And you've probably also noticed the intensity of that tension and the frequency with which thorny problems show up is growing. What that suggests to me as an executive coach working with leaders and their teams is that all of us have to be a bit better at getting comfortable with the discomfort and sitting in the tension just a little bit longer. Today's video is going to give you 3 different steps in a technique to help you get comfortable with the discomfort and discover solutions that you wouldn't find otherwise. I'm going to use a story to help illustrate what these techniques are. And as I go through, know that you're also going to get a handout so that you can use this same thing right away with your own thorny problem. The story I'm telling you was a couple of years ago. I was working with an organization, and in particular in the facilities division of this organization that had been primarily operating in the North American market. And they had merged with another company, and they were getting ready to open offices rebranded for the new merged organization. That meant they were operating in other cultures. In one case, they were working in Europe and France, and in the other case, they were working in China in Beijing. Really different cultures from North America. So they started to put their plans together. All the things that are necessary in order to have a brand coherent office presence, interior, systems, all the ways in which it would operate and welcome customers at the level of experience quality that this organization had earned a wonderful reputation for. Only it just wasn't going very well. The teams in North America were in resistance, feeling uncomfortable, feeling like it was too much risk to proceed. And those in France and those in China were having the same resistance for the opposite reason. So the executive in charge of facilities called me on the phone one day and said, I know we usually are talking about some things that are much more about my leadership style, but I really have a thorny problem I need to figure out a solution for. And I thought, this is the perfect time to apply this technique. We call this methodology a vehicle for generative change. And there are 3 steps to it. Why 3? Well, if it was easy for you to find the solution to this thorny problem, you would have already done it. So it takes a little time to break it down into smaller pieces that we can discover things that are a bit hidden, usually sitting underneath some assumptions and some biases that are operating unconsciously. That's not good or bad. It just is. Here's the first set of steps. You don't like the result that's happening right now. The opening of these rebranded offices are behind schedule and already over budget. And you're about to have mutiny on the work teams that are doing this in all of the locations. The actions that you've been taking, you realize, are based on a North American checklist that has been tested and validated many times over the last years. You absolutely have 100% faith in that checklist. Now I'm going to ask you, as I did this leader, to think about what was the basis of producing the actions that are on that checklist that right now aren't producing the results you want. And as it turns out, you realize that there are some policies. There are some practices that are governed by legal requirements in cities, counties, states, and the nation as a whole, both in America, provinces, and the nation as a whole in Canada, that don't exist in the French market or in the Chinese market. They have a whole other set of them, and they're not being taken into account. How did that get skipped in the planning of this project? If I start to think about getting some clarity about how we decided to use our American checklist as the basis. We were aligning to that to make decisions on what choices to pursue, what actions to implement. I start to realize that we might just have a belief that we're the only ones that know how to do it at the level of quality that our customers have come to expect. And we've discounted. Now I'm becoming aware about why we might have so much resistance in France and China, because they don't even know us very well, but they're in just as much resistance as my North American team members are. We've been discounting whether they have the knowledge, experience, capability, all the essential components to do the job as effectively as we have been doing it all these years in North America. Now, that's my first pass-through reflection. I wonder what else is here that we dismissed or disregarded as we were thinking about implementing these rebranding projects for the facilities around the world. All right, now you're ready for step 2. These are 4 questions to ask whenever you are presented with a thorny problem where you have resistance to taking a risk. Now notice I've put those 2 together now instead of separating them, because the truth is they are always sitting in tension to each other. Not really a paradox, nor is it really a polarity. They simply exist. Resistance tells us something. Just as you saw in the last technique, you began to realize that resistance is revealing that there's more going on here than being behind schedule, over budget, and negatively impacting morale in the workforce. And the risk is something that's worthy of taking. We've just finished acquiring. We want to get ourselves out there well branded. Can't everybody see that this is exactly the inspired thing to go be doing? But they're not seeing it because they're caught up in not being able to perform and produce the result we all want. So let's look at the 4 questions that are often the source of what is keeping these 2, resistance and risk taking, from finding the right harmony to address the situation we're in. The first question to ask yourself is, what are the preferences that we have around people, relationships, processes that we are taking for granted? They're operating because we've seen over time that they really work. Well, we've already seen a little bit of the clue, but there were a couple of more preferences. Turns out this leader had 2 long tenured personnel working in North America who absolutely carried a badge of honor around this checklist that they built. And neither one of them paused to ask themselves, gosh, will this work in France? Will this work in China? They instead said, we've got this. We know how to do this. And they proceeded without ever stopping to check it out. Like, maybe it's a little risky for us to think we can export from North America. And that led to some questions around, what are the habits that I might have as a leader? And I said to this gentleman, how often do you go to anybody else on your facilities team besides these 2 people when you have a high-risk project? It was a really long pause. And he says, I don't. He said, I have a habit of going to them when the risk is really high on the project, which of course, this has huge visibility from the C-suite, and they are counting on us to lower the anxiety in France and China because, of course, we're the acquiring entity and they're all feeling a little bit at risk around their jobs. So, of course, they're going to have some level of resistance. But I thought my best and brightest would be the ones to be able to address that because they're used to being able to do that. And that's what the checklist does. Right. So the habit, relying on the history, really put this leader into a tough pickle. There was no way with those 2 people he was going to be successful in creating openness to work with what was different in France and in China. He needed other people on the team. And in fact, he had people on his team who had emigrated from those locations and understood those cultures. And it never occurred to him that he ought to be sitting down and talking with them about this project before he just automatically delegated it to his two best and brightest. And so we go to the third question, which is, what are the assumptions we've been making about the nature of this project, and what was the best way to resource it? And again, we can carry the story forward and see that the reliance on past performance is, as they say in finance, not a predictor of future outcomes or results. And this was especially true in thinking that the best practice in North America was exportable. And it wasn't only that. There was one more assumption that showed up, which is who ought to be doing the work. And the feeling was, since they were the acquirer, that North America should be picking up the budget, therefore we would be using our personnel. And in making that assumption, they have completely dismissed the idea of working with local talent that would have the capability, the knowledge of the market, the knowledge of the customers, and an understanding of the legal structure, what the requirements would be for safety, and so on and so on and so on, completely left out of the formula because of the assumptions they made about being the acquiring entity and having a long history of doing this well. Fourth question, and this one is hard. This is a moment needing a lot of humility in order to be vulnerable enough to be a learner. And the questions are, what do I now see are the biases that are operating that actually have me be just a bit blind to the opportunity that doesn't exist in my current structure? It exists outside of what's known to me. Can I be in the unknown long enough to recognize who else might be a resource and part of the solution to what we have happening right now? And the biggest bias was that France and China weren't on board with this acquisition. As it turns out, which you'll see in a moment, that was the exact opposite. In both locations, they were super excited about all of the ways in which they could absorb a lot of what is done very well in North America, but they weren't being given the chance. They had been pushed away from working on the implementation of the project, almost like they were getting a package for Christmas instead of being part of wrapping the package in the first place. Now we can go back. We're going to take technique one, but we're going to do it in a little different order. So I asked the leader the same questions, but starting with awareness. Given what you're aware of now, having gone through what were my preferences, what were my habits, what were my assumptions, what were my biases, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? Now that you know all of that, it's now in your awareness. What do you want to inform your team to take into account as they construct a new approach? And he had several ideas starting to come to mind, and I happened to notice he was excited, not feeling quite so frustrated as he was at the beginning of our conversation. And he said, I need to set up some pairs, local with North America in both of those locations, and perhaps do a bit of brainstorming and re-describe, re-architect, I think was the word that he used, exactly what we're trying to accomplish in the customer experience, and let them work side by side. That'll do two things. The locals in France and China will have an opportunity to feel included. They'll get to see what our folks are like, and our folks are going to learn from them, particularly about what they don't know, so we can do a little preference and habit and assumption busting. That would be really healthy in the long run. So good short-term solution, good long-term solution. He had some other ideas too, but I wanted to pick up on that one just a little bit and go to the clarity step. What do you have to believe in order to be with discomfort that might show up even with that right answer? Because you're going to come up with some other right answers, but let's work with that one. What do you have to believe in case you get resistance surfacing from any corner with this new idea that you have? Well, I have to believe that there are people who have the answer and that we need to give them an opportunity to express the answers that they see on the ground locally, because we clearly cannot see there, and we've been our own barriers with our biases. Okay, so that's the belief you're operating under. What then becomes the decision-making basis? Is it a value? Is it a principle? Are there criteria? And he said, well, clearly it's not our checklist. And I said, are you sure? Are you going to build resistance if you throw the checklist out completely? And he said, no, I don't mean throw it out completely. I think it's a good scaffolding, but we need one that is tailored specifically to France and to China. So that's criteria 1. And criteria 2 is they get to decide with counsel and input from all of us in North America who have a long history of best practice around this body of work of rebranding and creating facilities for the customer experience that our customers have come to expect from us. I said, okay, so is that enough? Is there anything else that is important to communicate to your teams about how they make those decisions, about what actions to take in what order? And he said, I think there is one more, which is that I believe in the ability of the local teams to accept ownership for this, that they'll fulfill their responsibility, and that I'm not taking decision-making away from my North American team. I'm actually elevating them into master consultant without needing to be the ones who are on the hook for the implementation. They are on the hook for building good partnership. So through partnership is how we get our work done, becomes the alignment step. I said, okay, so now what? And he said, I need to have a conversation with all of them about what I just learned here so they can revise their action plans and we can calibrate the budget and get going, which was great. And of course, I'm telling you the story because they ultimately did exactly what I just described to you. They got the projects back on track and they actually ended up implementing early. Couldn't do anything about the overage on the budget, but the customers are happy and all the facilities are up and operating. So what I've walked you through here is what we call in coaching a reflection practice. And not just to give yourself a walk down memory lane and kind of look at some things that worked and some things that didn't work, but something more pragmatic and practical, working with a real thorny problem and breaking it down so that you can see what's been hidden because of the way in which habit, preference, assumption, and bias operate. It keeps us from seeing what's changed in the environment that we discounted or dismissed. And that's the value of working with a vehicle for generative change. I hope I've inspired you to want to apply these 3 techniques in the vehicle for generative change to your own thorny problems. So go to the link down below. It takes you to our website, invitechange.com, where you can download the tool. And an even better gift for you, the Vanguard Conversation Series is happening all throughout this year. You might be able to see it live this week, depending on when you're watching this. If not, you'll be able to see it on recording. They're all free, and we have one of our guest leaders who comes and talks through a thorny problem they have just resolved for themselves using the vehicle for generative change. When you come live, you'll get a chance to interact with that leader and have your own opportunity to work with the tool with someone else who is a guest at the conversation and start to get a rhythm for yourself with resolving thorny problems with the vehicle for generative change.